The wine glass in my hand was the only thing keeping me steady. Across the table, my husband leaned back in his chair, laughing with three men I'd never met before that night, his voice loose from the bottle he'd already gone through alone. I smiled the way a wife smiles when she doesn't want to be noticed, the way I'd learned to smile for 8 years. My name is Oneida. I run an event company 2 hours from where we sat that night, the kind of business built on remembering details other people forget. That skill would matter more before the night was over than anything on that dinner table. Elvin's friends were from his work overseas, in from Lisbon for the week, and he'd wanted to show me off, or maybe show himself off through me. I didn't know which. I'd spent the whole dinner nodding at words I wasn't supposed to understand, letting him believe the language between him and his colleagues was a locked room I had no key to. He didn't know I'd spent 3 years early in my career working with international clients, 3 years learning to hear a language until it stopped sounding foreign and started sounding like weather. He never asked. He never needed to. To him, I was the wife who smiled and poured wine and didn't ask questions about business trips or bank transfers, or why his phone stayed face down on every table we shared. By the time I feel like most of you are still figuring out where I'm going with this, let me ask, where are you watching from tonight? I always like knowing who's sitting with me while I tell this. Elvin refilled his glass a 4th time and leaned toward the man beside him, lowering his voice like a secret. Except secrets don't stay secrets when you assume no one at the table can hear you clearly. He said it in Portuguese, easy, like a joke between friends. He said he was having his fun with the mother, and that her daughter was carrying his child too, and that both of us were too naive to notice anything. I didn't move. My face stayed exactly where I'd left it 30 minutes earlier. Pleasant, distant, a little bored the way wives are supposed to look at dinners like this. Inside, something went very still and very cold. The kind of stillness that comes right before a decision gets made instead of a feeling. His friends laughed. One of them glanced at me out of habit, checking if I understood. The way you check a locked door out of instinct, even when you know it's locked. I lifted the bottle from the center of the table and poured more wine into his glass first, then mine, unhurried, my hand not shaking at all. I set the bottle down and looked at him, not raising my voice, not changing my expression, and I answered him in his own language, the one he thought belonged only to him. I told him he wasn't the father of anyone's child, that he'd never had the ability to be, and that I'd known that failure since the earliest years of our marriage. Then I added, softly, that I supposed I wouldn't know anything about that. The table went quiet in a way dinner tables don't go quiet by accident. One man set his fork down. Another looked at Elvin like he was seeing him for the first time. Nobody at that table was just a dinner guest anymore. They were witnesses now, and every one of them knew it before Elvin did. The car stayed quiet for the first 4 miles, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, pressing against the windows. Elvin's hands sat tight on the wheel, knuckles pale under the dashboard light, and I watched the road instead of him. My own hands folded calm in my lap like nothing at that table had happened at all. He broke first. His voice came out low, controlled in a way that told me he was working hard to keep it that way. He wanted to know where I'd learned Portuguese, how long I'd been hiding it, what else I'd been hiding from him. I gave him nothing. I looked out the window at the streetlights sliding past and let the silence answer for me. That silence cracked something in him faster than words would have. He started talking fast, the way people do when they're building an explanation instead of remembering the truth. He said I didn't understand what I'd heard, that it was just talk between men, drinks loosening tongues, nothing that meant anything. He said the thing about the daughter was a joke, an exaggeration, the kind of thing men say to sound interesting in front of friends. I let him finish. I always Let people finish, especially when they're handing me more than they mean to. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I told him I'd known about his condition since early in our marriage, since a doctor's office we'd sat in together years ago, since the day he decided it wasn't worth revisiting, and I decided not to push him. I told him I'd carried that knowledge quietly for years, the way I carried a lot of things quietly. His jaw tightened. I watched it happen from the corner of my eye, the muscle working under his skin like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. He asked what that had to do with tonight, his voice sharper now, defensive in a way that told me he was scrambling to understand how much ground he'd actually lost. I didn't answer that either. I let him sit in it, let him do the math himself, let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of pressure. I've learned that people reveal more trying to feel quiet than they ever do responding to a direct question. He tried once more, quieter this time, almost gentle, the tone he used to use on me in the early years when he wanted something smoothed over. He said I was imagining things, blowing a joke out of proportion, making something out of nothing the way people do when they've had too much wine themselves. I turned my head and looked at him then. Really looked, and I smiled. Not a big smile, not an angry one, just enough to unsettle him. The kind of smile that tells a man you know something he hasn't figured out yet. I didn't say a word. He looked back at the road, and I watched his hands tighten further on the wheel, watched him decide not to ask again, watched him convince himself that silence meant he still had room to move. He was wrong about that, though he wouldn't understand how wrong for a while yet. For now, all he had was uncertainty, and I intended to let him keep it. The house was silent when we got in, Elvin already gone upstairs without a word, and I stood in my kitchen running water into a glass I didn't drink from, just to have something in my hands. That's when the memory came, uninvited. The way memories do when your body finally stops bracing long enough to let them in. 2 months before that dinner, my daughter sat across from me at this same counter, her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from either. Deshauna doesn't cry easy. She gets that from me. So when she did, quiet and ashamed, I knew before she said a word that whatever came next would change something permanently. She told me there'd been one night, one mistake, alone in this house with Elvin while I was away for work. Wine, bad judgment, a door that should have stayed closed. She told me like she expected me to look at her differently, like she'd already rehearsed the shame on her own face before she brought it to mine. I didn't look at her differently. I set my glass down and I listened, and underneath the listening, something in me went quiet and sharp at the same time. A fury I didn't let touch my voice or my face because Deshauna needed steadiness from me right then, not another person falling apart in front of her. She told me about the pregnancy next, and about Jeremiah, and I watched her brace herself for judgment that never came from me, not for 1 second. She already knew the dates better than anyone. She and Jeremiah had known for weeks before that night, with Elvin, ever happened. The timing wasn't confusion. It was math, plain and settled, and it had never once pointed toward Elvin, not from the very beginning. I told her that. I said the numbers don't lie, even when people do, and whatever Elvin thought he knew, whatever story he was building for himself, it was built on sand. She needed to hear that more than she needed comfort, though I gave her both. Then she told me what he'd started doing. The messages, the demands to stay quiet, to give him money, to put distance between herself and Jeremiah, or he'd make sure everyone believed his version instead of hers. Something in me wanted to walk straight upstairs right then, wake him, put every word of it in his face before I'd had time to think past the fury. I sat with that urge a moment, let it rise all the way up before I set it back down. Confronting him that night would have felt like something, but it wouldn't have protected her, and protecting her mattered more than the satisfaction of saying my piece. I remember my hands going still on the counter, remember deciding right then, before I said another word to her, that this wasn't a conversation for tears. This was a conversation for strategy. I told my daughter to pay him, small amounts, whatever he asked for first, and to keep every message he ever sent her. I told her to let him believe he'd won, because a man convinced he's winning stops watching his back. I didn't tell her everything I was already doing on my end. Some things a mother carries alone until the moment they're needed. Standing in my kitchen that night, water still running over my hand in the sink, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully feel until then. Tonight at that dinner wasn't an accident I stumbled into. It was the first real test of a plan I'd already set in motion months ago. And Elvin had just failed the test without knowing he was taking it. Deshauna called me 2 nights after that dinner, her voice tight in a way I recognized immediately, the same tightness she'd carried into my kitchen 2 months before. She told me she'd just sent another transfer, hands shaking so bad she typed the amount wrong the first time. I asked her what changed. She said everything had changed since that dinner went unpunished in Elvin's eyes. He'd raised his demands, more money this time, and something new. He wanted her further from Jeremiah, fewer visits, fewer calls, where he might overhear her voice sounding too settled, too happy. He'd told her a happy woman doesn't keep secrets as carefully as a frightened one, and he intended to keep her frightened. I told her to keep doing exactly what she'd been doing since the beginning. Screenshot everything. Save every transfer confirmation, every message where he named an amount or a threat in the same sentence. She already had 2 months of it saved, methodical the way I'd taught her to be. And I told her 2 months was about to become something a courtroom would recognize as a pattern, not an accident. She went quiet on the phone, and I heard something underneath the quiet, something closer to exhaustion than fear now. She said Jeremiah had started noticing, not guessing details, just noticing her, the way people notice weather changing before they understand the storm behind it. She told me about a night that week when he'd reached for her hand across the couch, and she'd pulled it back without meaning to. Some reflex built from months of flinching at nothing. He hadn't said anything then. He'd just looked at her a beat too long, filing it away the way steady men do, quietly, without accusation. She almost told him everything that night, she admitted to me. The words had gotten as far as her throat, sitting right behind her teeth, and she'd swallowed them back down because once she said it out loud to him, it stopped being a secret she controlled and became something that belonged to both of them. She wasn't ready to hand him that weight yet, not without knowing how he'd carry it. I understood that better than she realized. Some truths you hold alone a little longer, not out of distrust, but because saying them out loud makes them permanent in a way silence never does. She told me the rest of it in a smaller voice. Jeremiah had asked her directly 2 nights ago, sitting in his car outside her apartment, engine off, no music, nothing to hide behind. He'd told her he knew something was wrong, had known for weeks, and this time he wasn't going to let her wave it off with a tired smile and a change of subject. She said she'd told him she was fine. She said he hadn't believed her, hadn't even pretended to, and that before she got out of the car, he told her plainly that he loved her too much to keep watching her disappear a little more every week without saying something about it. I sat with the phone against my ear long after she hung up, thinking about how close we were now to something breaking open, one way or another, and how little control either of us had left over which way it broke. I keep my office locked, even from Elvin, especially from Elvin. And that Saturday morning, I sat behind my desk with 3 years of business statements spread out in front of me, Coffee going cold at my elbow while I traced numbers that didn't add up the way they should have. I'd started looking 2 nights after the dinner, quietly. An hour here and there when he thought I was catching up on invoices. The first thing that caught my eye wasn't dramatic at all. Just a vendor name that sat slightly wrong on the page, a letter off from one I actually used. I almost let it go. Instead, I pulled the invoice attached to it and found a payment amount that didn't match anything I remembered approving. That led me to the next thread, a transfer routed through an account I barely recognized, small enough that I understood immediately why I'd never noticed it before. I followed that one back further, cross-checking it against statements from the year before, and found a second transfer using the same pattern, then a third. It took most of that morning, one loose thread pulling the next, before anything started to resemble a shape. I found the biggest one just past 10, a debt from 4 years back, buried under that same slightly wrong vendor name I'd started with. Close enough to the real one that I understood now why it had slipped past me for so long. 4 years of interest sitting quiet under my name as much as his, because that's how marriage works when you don't ask enough questions early enough. I didn't raise my voice sitting there alone with that discovery. There was no one to raise it to. What I did instead was photograph every page, every account number, every date, and save it in a folder I'd only just started building. Anger, I've learned, does more work when it's channeled into something with edges instead of something with volume. Elvin found me still at my desk when he wandered in around noon, coffee mug in hand, looking at me the way he'd looked at me for years, like I was furniture that occasionally spoke. He mentioned, almost in passing, that things were tight again this month, and could I move something from the business account his way, just until a contract came through. Then he added, lighter than he meant it to land, that it wouldn't be much trouble for me since it wasn't like my little events thing needed careful watching anyway. He smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that expects agreement, not the kind that expects to be remembered. I didn't correct him. I told him I'd take care of it. Calm, easy, the same voice I'd used to agree with him for years. And I watched something in his shoulders relax, some old certainty settling back into place, the certainty that I was still exactly who he thought I was. I moved the money that afternoon, small enough not to raise a question anywhere, and I logged the transfer the same way I'd logged everything else that week, dated and screenshotted. Another line in a pattern that no longer needed my anger to prove itself. It proved itself. Before I closed my laptop that evening, I created one more folder, separate from the others, and typed a name into the label. A name I hadn't said out loud to anyone yet, not even to my daughter. Nobody in that house knew it yet. Not Elvin. Still upstairs believing tonight had gone exactly the way every other night had gone for 8 years. Not even Deshauna, still carrying her own weight, 2 months into hers. Just me, alone in a locked office, holding the first real thread of something I intended to pull all the way through. Deshauna came to my house the evening after, and I knew before she sat down at my table that something had shifted, because she sat the way she used to sit as a teenager, confessing something she couldn't carry alone anymore. She told me Jeremiah had pulled his car over 2 nights ago instead of driving straight to her building, cutting the engine in a quiet stretch of road, and asked her plainly if she was hiding something from him. Not accusing, just asking. Steady, the way he asks everything. Like he already knew the answer was yes and was only waiting for her to catch up to it. She said she'd tried the usual deflection first, told him she was just tired. Work stress, nothing worth talking about. She said he hadn't argued with her. He'd just waited, silent, letting the quiet in the car do what quiet does, until she felt the words rising up her throat, whether she gave them permission or not. She told him part of it. Not everything, not the night with Elvin itself, but enough. That Elvin had been asking her for money, that he'd been threatening to twist a story about her if she didn't comply, that she'd been documenting it at my instruction, hoping it would end on its own before it needed to become anyone else's problem. She said his face didn't do what she expected. No anger directed at her, no accusation, nothing that made her regret speaking. Just a stillness, controlled. His jaw tight, the way a man's jaw gets tight when he's deciding how much of his anger to let show and how much to fold away for later use. She was afraid, she told me. Afraid this had already broken something between them. Afraid she'd handed him a weight he never signed up to carry. Afraid the plan I'd built so carefully now had a variable in it neither of us controlled. But then, she said, he told her something that surprised her. He said he'd sensed something wrong about Elvin longer than she knew. Something in the way Elvin looked at her sometimes when he thought no one else was watching. Something in the way he spoke to her like he was owed something. Jeremiah said he'd never had proof, just a feeling he hadn't trusted himself to name out loud. Not until tonight gave the feeling a shape. She told me that was the moment something in her chest loosened, hearing that she hadn't lost an ally. She'd finally found one who'd been standing closer than she realized. Jeremiah told her he wasn't going anywhere, that whatever this was, she wasn't carrying it by herself anymore, starting tonight. Then he said the thing that made her call me the second she got upstairs, still catching her breath from saying it all out loud for the first time. He told her he wanted to go to the police with her. Not eventually. Not once things got worse. Now, while there was still time to do it on their terms, instead of Elvin's. I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment after she finished, feeling something settle in me that hadn't been there before, something steadier. My daughter wasn't just protected anymore. She was standing next to someone willing to stand in front of this with her. I sat in a small office downtown that Wednesday. The folder from my desk finally out of my house and into someone else's hands. And I realized as I sat down that this was the first time I'd said any of it out loud to a person who wasn't my daughter. The attorney across from me was a woman close to my age, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind who let silence sit in a room without rushing to fill it, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. I laid out what I had. The buried debt. The transfers routed through names that weren't quite right. Years of numbers that didn't match the story Elvin told at dinner parties about how well things were going for him. She went through it slower than I expected, asking questions instead of offering comfort, which suited me fine. She asked when each account was opened, whether I'd known at the time, whether any of it had touched my business directly. I answered everything I could, watching her write in shorthand I couldn't follow, watching her nod at certain answers longer than others. She told me Georgia doesn't split things 50-50 the way people assume from movies. It divides things fairly, which isn't the same, and fair depends heavily on conduct, on who spent recklessly, who hid what, who let debt pile up quietly while pretending otherwise. She said years of undisclosed debt, documented the way I documented mine, could reasonably influence a judge's sense of what's fair, though she was careful to add that no two judges weigh it identically, and she wouldn't promise me a number or an outcome before a single filing had even been made. I felt something in my chest loosen, hearing that, even measured the way she gave it, some fear I hadn't let myself name settling slightly. Then she was even more careful with me, the way a good lawyer is careful, not letting relief turn into false certainty. She told me my business, since it started years before the marriage, would likely have its early value treated as mine alone, though likely was the most she'd offer me. Whatever growth happened during these 8 years wasn't automatically untouchable just because my name was the only one on the paperwork. And how a judge chose to value that growth wasn't something she could predict with confidence this early. Nothing in a marriage stays completely separate once a judge starts looking at fairness instead of ownership. And nothing about a divorce, she reminded me gently, moves in a straight line. I appreciated that she didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. I'd spent 8 years married to a man who told me what he wanted me to hear, and I'd had enough of comfortable lies to last the rest of my life. She told me the documentation mattered more than I'd realized walking in. not just as proof of debt, but as proof of pattern, of years of one person absorbing consequences, the other created and hid. Judges, weigh that, she said. More than people expect, though she stopped short of telling me how much weight mine would carry until she'd had time to review all of it properly. I sat with that a moment, feeling something steadier take root where the fear had been. Not certainty exactly, but something close enough to hold on to. Before I stood to leave, I told her there was one more thing. I hadn't said it to anyone yet, not even to Shauna, not even inside my own house where the walls sometimes felt like they were listening back. I told her I had a recording from the dinner, his own voice, saying exactly what he thought no one else understood. She looked up from her notes for the first time since I'd sat down, and something shifted in her expression, quiet and immediate, like she'd just realized the case in front of her was bigger than the folder I'd handed her. I'd set up alerts on our joint account years ago, back when a bounced payment nearly cost us a vendor deposit, and I'd never turned them off since. That morning, the notification came through on my phone before he'd even finished typing the confirmation. A transfer attempt larger than anything he'd tried to move before, routed toward an account I didn't recognize at all. I sat with my coffee going cold and watched the request sit pending, and I let it sit there a moment before I did anything about it. He'd been different for days by then, quieter in a way that wasn't peace, jumpier at doors closing, at my phone buzzing, at silences he used to fill without thinking and now filled too quickly. Like silence itself had started to feel dangerous to him. I found him in the kitchen that evening, and I told him, plain and even, that I'd seen a transfer attempt come through that morning, and I wanted to understand what it was for. He didn't answer right away. He busied himself with a cabinet he didn't need to open, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a careful flatness to it, like a man choosing each word before he let it out. He said he was moving some funds around, nothing unusual, just business. The same phrase he'd used for 8 years to close a door I used to let stay closed. I told him I'd need more than that this time. He looked at me then, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're trying to recalculate how much they actually know. Neither of us said what we meant. He asked, too casually, whether I'd spoken to anyone lately. Anyone at all. I told him I spoke to plenty of people and asked which anyone he meant. He didn't answer that either. We stood in that kitchen trading half sentences neither of us intended to finish, both of us aware the conversation had a second one running underneath it, that neither would surface first. He brought up his colleagues without meaning to, I think, a stray thought slipping out under pressure. He said something about how men talk too much after a few drinks, how things said at a dinner shouldn't follow a person around afterward, how he hoped his friends understood that a joke didn't need repeating to people who weren't there. He wasn't talking to me anymore by the end of that. He was talking himself into believing it. I said nothing to that. I let him hear his own words hang in the kitchen air a moment longer than comfortable, and I watched something in his face shift, a flicker of a man realizing he'd just revealed more fear than reassurance. His phone rang before either of us said anything else, and he startled at it, actually startled, the way people do when they've been waiting for a call they dreaded. He stepped into the hallway to take it, but the kitchen wasn't big enough to hide his voice from me. Not that night. It was one of the men from dinner. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. A stiffness in Elvin's tone that hadn't been there with these men before. Apologies where there used to be ease. A silence on his end that told me the man on the other line was pulling back from him, carefully. The way people distance themselves from something that started to look like a liability instead of a friendship. Elvin came back into the kitchen a different color than he'd left it, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't try to explain anything to me at all. I sat in the waiting area of that police station with my hands folded the same way I'd folded them in a car 2 months back, watching a door Deshauna and Jeremiah had walked through 20 minutes before, unable to see what and was happening on the other side of it. Only able to wait the way mothers learn to wait, once waiting is the only thing left to offer. She'd called that morning and told me she was ready. Not shaking, not uncertain, just ready in a way that told me something in her had finally settled into place. Jeremiah drove her. I met them there instead of riding along because she'd asked me to let her walk in on her own 2 feet, and I understood that better than she probably expected me to. When she came out, she told me everything before we'd even reached the car, words coming faster than I'd heard from her in months, like something long held had finally found the door open. She said the detective was younger than she expected, but serious in a way that put her at ease almost immediately. No wasted words, no doubt in his face, while she laid out the messages one by one, dates lined up beside amounts, screenshots she'd been collecting exactly the way I'd taught her. He didn't rush her. He asked questions the way the attorney had asked me questions, methodical, unbothered by silence. She told him about the threats to expose a version of events that wasn't true, about the money, about how it started small and grew heavier every week since that dinner. She said somewhere in the middle of laying it all out, her voice had started shaking, not from fear this time, but from the strange relief of finally saying it to someone whose job was to do something about it. She told me she'd asked him, quiet, almost embarrassed to ask at all, what happened if he came after her before anything moved forward, if telling the truth today made tonight or tomorrow more dangerous instead of safer. The detective hadn't brushed the question off. He told her retaliation was something they took seriously, that reporting it created a record now working in her favor, not against her, and that the pattern she'd handed him today was substantial on its own. She said something in her chest loosened hearing him say that. Months of carrying it alone, finally settling onto shoulders built to hold it properly, shoulders that weren't just hers anymore. Before they left, the detective asked her one more thing, and she repeated it to me carefully, like she wanted to get the exact words right. He asked if there was any other evidence connected to this, anything else that might exist beyond the messages and the payments, anything that could speak to what kind of man they were dealing with beyond what she'd already shown him. She told me she'd looked at Jeremiah before answering, then back at the detective, and said she didn't know, that there might be, that her mother would know better than she did. Standing in that parking lot, I felt the weight of what I hadn't told her yet settle differently in me than it had before. She didn't know about the recording. Not yet. But something told me that question wasn't going to wait much longer to be answered. Deshauna told me about the phone call before I heard anything from anyone else, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in weeks, though I could still hear the effort underneath the steadiness. The detective had reached out to Elvin 2 days after her statement. Informal at first, just questions, the kind that let a man believe he still has room to talk his way through something. She said Elvin had come home that night different, too talkative, too eager to explain himself before anyone had accused him of anything directly. He told her a version of events that night that had nothing to do with what actually happened. He said she'd been the one who wouldn't leave him alone after that one mistake, that she'd asked him for money herself, that whatever the detective had been shown had been twisted to make him look like something he wasn't. He denied any threat, any demand, any version where he'd been the one applying pressure. She said she sat there and let him finish, the same way I'd once let him finish in that car outside the dinner. And she told me that letting him talk had never felt so useful before, because every sentence he built dug him deeper into a story that didn't match a single message he'd ever sent her. The detective noticed the same thing, she told me. He'd mentioned to her, carefully, that what Elvin described privately didn't align with what he'd told colleagues about the situation before, small inconsistencies stacking on top of each other until they stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a man improvising. Then Elvin turned to her directly, she said. That same night, cornered and desperate in a way she'd never seen from him before. He asked her to go back to the detective and say it had all been a misunderstanding, that she'd exaggerated, that none of it needed to go any further if she just took it back now while there was still time. She told me she looked at him and said no. Not loud, not shaking, just steady. The first time she'd stood in front of him and refused something without flinching afterward. She said watching his face when she said it told her more than anything else had. Some final piece of control leaving him in that exact moment, landing somewhere she couldn't see yet, but somewhere he clearly felt. She told me one last thing before we hung up. Elvin's phone had rung again just as she was leaving his house that evening, and this time it wasn't a colleague from dinner calling to distance himself. It was the department, asking him to come in, formally, to talk. She said his face went pale in a way she'd never seen on him before. My own attorney called later that night, a separate matter entirely, updating me that the subpoena for Elvin's older medical records, filed weeks earlier as part of the estate case, had finally been returned. She mentioned it almost in passing, a procedural update among several others, but I sat with my phone a long moment after we hung up, understanding exactly what those records would confirm and exactly how quietly that confirmation had arrived. I didn't mention any of it to Deshauna that night. Some things still felt like mine to carry alone a little while longer. In the 2 weeks after Elvin's informal conversation with the detective, Deshauna told me updates came steadily, if quietly. The detective had gone back through the messages line by line, matching every payment to its date on her bank statement, confirming a pattern that lined up too precisely to explain away. He'd spoken again with the colleague who'd first pulled back from Elvin, taking a formal statement this time instead of an informal one. By the time the call finally came inviting Elvin in, the file sitting behind it was no longer a handful of screenshots. It was weeks of corroborated groundwork, each piece checked against the next. The call came late morning, and I almost didn't answer it because the number wasn't one I recognized, until a voice on the other end told me she was calling on Elvin's behalf, her own voice tight and reluctant, like she didn't want the task she'd been handed. It was one of his colleagues, the same one who'd started distancing himself weeks before. He told me Elvin had gone to what he believed was a routine sit-down that morning, a follow-up to informal questions from before, nothing he seemed worried about walking in. He said Elvin had actually looked relaxed getting out of his car, straightening his jacket the way he does before something he wants to control. He wasn't prepared for what waited for him instead. The colleague told me detectives were there, not just the one who'd been asking questions before, and this time there was no soft framing to it. They read him his rights in the parking lot, in front of 2 other men from his own circle who'd come along thinking they were meeting a business associate, not watching him get walked to a car with his hands cuffed behind him. He said Elvin's face went through something he'd never seen on him before. Shock first, quick and raw, and then something closer to humiliation, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood by everyone standing close enough to witness it. The same men who'd laughed with him at that dinner months ago stood there now, watching a different kind of scene entirely. And this time, there was no wine to pour, no clever line to save him. He told me Elvin tried to talk his way out of it right there in the lot, raising his voice loud enough that others stopped to look. He said my name, more than once, telling the detective this was something I'd orchestrated, some kind of setup, some conspiracy built by a wife who wanted him gone and had convinced her daughter to lie to make it happen. The detective, the colleague said, didn't raise his voice to match. He simply told Elvin they had messages spanning months, financial records showing a clear pattern, and testimony that lined up cleanly with both. He said it plainly, almost bored, the way people speak when they've already seen the outcome coming from a distance. I drove to the station within the hour, Not because anyone asked me to, but because some things you need to see with your own eyes to finish believing. I stood in a hallway I wasn't allowed past, and through a half-open door, I caught a glimpse of him seated at a table, jacket wrinkled now. Nothing left of the man who'd leaned back laughing at that dinner with a room full of witnesses he thought understood nothing. An officer near the door mentioned, not unkindly, that he'd asked for a lawyer already, and that somewhere in the middle of that request, he'd asked them to reach out to me too. Like some old habit hadn't caught up yet, with everything that had changed between us. I didn't go closer. I stood exactly where I was, watching a man ask for the one person he'd never once, in 8 years, thought he needed permission to disrespect. My phone rang from the jail's number 2 days after his arrest, and I looked at it a long moment before I let it go to voicemail, unhurried, the same way I'd once poured wine before answering a man who thought silence meant surrender. I didn't listen to the message that day. I had somewhere else to be. My attorney had asked me in that morning to finally hand over the recording, and I sat across from her and the prosecutor both, a small device between us on the table, like it weighed more than it looked like it should. I told them what was on it, plainly, no dramatics, just the facts of that dinner laid out the way I'd lived them. The prosecutor listened to it once, all the way through, her face giving away nothing until the end, when she looked up at me and said his own voice had just handed them something no amount of denial could undo. Not an accusation from someone with a reason to lie about him. Just him, in his own words. Certain no one at that table understood a language he'd never bothered to learn, belonged to his own wife, too. She told me the case against him didn't need much else beyond what already sat in front of her. Months of messages laying out the threats in his own words. A payment trail showing exactly what Deshauna had handed over and when. And now, this recording. His own voice at that dinner. Arrogant enough to say plainly what he'd never admit to a detective directly. Together, she said. That was more than enough to move forward cleanly. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that the medical records were part of the file too, the same ones my own attorney had already told me about days earlier. She confirmed they mattered for the civil side, part of the pattern of concealment argument my attorney was building around the debt. But she was clear it wasn't something the criminal case rested on. His own words and the money trail were doing that work entirely on their own. I understood what she meant. The records confirmed something I already knew, privately, for years, and had already heard confirmed once before this conversation. The recording and the messages were what would actually hold him accountable in a courtroom. His attorney tried, days later, to have the recording thrown out, arguing I'd captured it without his knowledge, without consent, something improper about a wife recording her own husband at dinner. My attorney told me later, almost amused, how quickly that argument collapsed once the judge pointed out Georgia only requires one person, in a conversation, to consent to it being recorded, and I had been sitting right there the entire time. The recording was admitted. The messages and payment records stood as they always had. 3 plain pieces of evidence, none of them dramatic on their own, all of them impossible to argue with together. I felt something settle in me hearing that news. Not triumph exactly, something steadier than that. Something closer to arriving somewhere I'd been walking toward for months without letting myself name the destination out loud. That evening, my attorney called again. One more update before the day closed out. One of his Portuguese colleagues, the same one who'd started distancing himself weeks before, had reached out to the prosecutor's office directly. He said he remembered every word from that dinner clearly, remembered the boasting, remembered exactly what Elvin had said, and how certain he'd been that no one at that table could understand it. He told them he was willing to testify to what he'd heard. I sat with my phone in my hand a long while after that call ended, thinking of a dinner table months ago, of a man pouring confidence into a room he thought belonged entirely to him, never once imagining that room would someday turn into the very thing that finished him. I signed the complaint for divorce on a Tuesday morning. My attorney's office quiet around me. The same quiet I'd learned to sit inside comfortably over these past months. And I felt none of the fear I once thought a moment like this would carry. The filing cited what we'd built carefully for weeks: years of undisclosed debt, transfers routed through names that weren't quite right, business funds absorbed without my knowledge into a pattern that had a shape once you finally laid it all out flat. My attorney called it dissipation, a word I hadn't known before this year, though I'd been living its meaning for most of my marriage without a name for it. Elvin's attorney requested a meeting before the temporary hearing, and I sat across a conference table from a man I used to share a bed with, out on bond now, thinner than I remembered, his composure worn down to something brittle around the edges. He had criminal charges sitting over him from the extortion case, and now this, civil papers laying out 8 years of financial conduct he'd never expected anyone to add up so completely. My attorney told me before we walked in that he had almost nowhere left to maneuver, not really. Boxed in from 2 directions at once with no clean way out of either. He tried anyway. He always tries. He looked at me across that table and softened his voice into something old, something he used to use when he wanted a door to reopen that I'd already closed. He talked about our years together, about the version of us he remembered from the beginning, before the failures piled up, before the debts, before a daughter's pain became something he tried to profit from instead of protect. He asked if any of that still meant something to me, not defensively this time, almost pleading, like a man reaching for the last tool he had left in a box that had run empty everywhere else. I let him finish. I always let people finish. Then I told him, calm, not unkind, not cruel, just finished, that I remembered those years too, clearly, more clearly than he probably wanted me to. I told him I remembered a doctor's office, a diagnosis he never returned to face, a debt he built quietly while I built something honest beside him. I told him none of what we once were changed, what he'd chosen to become, and that I wasn't interested in returning to a version of us that had been a lie for longer than it had ever been true. He didn't respond to that. There wasn't much left to say once the softness in his voice met the stillness in mine, and found nothing there to work with. The judge, later that week, reviewed the complaint and the documentation attached to it, and set a date for the final hearing on equitable distribution. A real date now. Circled on a calendar instead of hanging somewhere abstract in the future, the one that would settle in a judgment and decree of divorce, exactly how much of what he'd built on borrowed money and buried debt he'd actually be allowed to keep. I left that courthouse without looking back toward the room where he sat with his attorney, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, I felt no pull to look back at all. Whatever hold he still imagined he had over me had finally, completely, run out of road. Deshauna called me that Sunday evening, her voice steady in a way that told me before she said anything that whatever had happened hadn't shaken her the way it once would have. Elvin had reached out to her directly, a text first, then a call she almost let go to voicemail out of habit before deciding, calmly, that she wasn't afraid of answering it anymore. He was living apart from the house now, a condition tied to his pending case that kept him away from me specifically, given everything tied to the estate. There was no order barring him from Deshauna the same way, though Jeremiah pointed out afterward, evenly, that reaching out to her at all, given the criminal case still open against him, wasn't the kind of thing his own attorney would likely thank him for. They talked about mentioning it to the detective, just so it sat on record. She said his voice sounded smaller than she remembered, none of the certainty he used to carry into every room he walked into. He told her he missed her, missed the family they used to be, framed it like something that had simply happened to all of them rather than something he'd built with his own hands and burned down the same way. He asked her if she really wanted to see this through to the end, if she understood what it would cost him, like the cost was something she owed him an accounting for. She told me she sat with the phone against her ear, Jeremiah beside her on the couch, not speaking, just present. his hand resting over hers, the way it had been resting there for months now, whenever she needed steadying. She said she didn't feel the old flinch rise up in her chest, the way it used to whenever Elvin's name came up. She told him, plainly, that she understood exactly what it would cost him, and that she hadn't built this cost. He had. Every dollar, every threat, every night she'd sat awake sending him money she'd earned honestly to protect a lie he'd created out of nothing. He tried once more, softer, almost pleading, the same worn tone I'd heard across a conference table weeks earlier. She told me it didn't land on her the way it once might have. There was nothing left for him to threaten her with, no secret left unspoken, no story left untold, no fear left in her that he could still reach. She laid it out for him herself, she told me, calm the whole time. His business ties gone, his colleagues testifying against him instead of laughing beside him. The estate hearing set, waiting to divide what was left of everything he'd built on borrowed money and other people's silence. The criminal case moving steadily toward trial, no version of events left for him to reshape in his favor. He didn't have an answer for any of it. She told me the call ended quieter than it started. No argument. No last plea landing anywhere close to her. Later that night, my attorney called with one more update. Elvin's defense had reached out to negotiate, given the weight of the evidence stacked against him. A plea agreement was being discussed, and if accepted, a sentencing hearing would follow shortly after. I told Deshauna when we spoke again that this was likely how it would end, not with a trial dragging out for months, but with him finally admitting, in the only way left available to him, that there was nothing left to fight. She was quiet a moment, then told me she was ready for that ending, however it arrived. Deshauna and Jeremiah came to my house that evening, the same kitchen where she first told me the truth 2 months before any of this reached a courtroom, and we sat together at that counter one more time, though everything about the silence between us felt different now. My attorney had called earlier that day with the outcome. Elvin had accepted the plea. Felony theft by extortion. The charge finally named plainly after months of circling it through messages and payment records, and one recording he never imagined would outlive the confidence he said it with. Probation followed the plea, along with restitution ordered directly to Deshauna. Every dollar he'd taken from her now owed back, with interest. Neither of us had to calculate ourselves. The months he'd already spent held before the plea counted against whatever jail time remained, leaving little more to serve beyond what he'd already sat through waiting for this exact ending. It wasn't the kind of ending you see dramatized in courtroom scenes built for outrage. It was smaller than that, quieter. The kind of ending real consequences usually look like when you strip away everything performed about them. He would carry a felony record now everywhere he went, in every room he tried to walk into with the old confidence. He would pay back what he'd taken, slowly, under supervision, for as long as the court required it. And whatever colleagues once treated him as someone worth impressing were long gone, scattered the moment his own recorded voice became the loudest witness against him. Deshauna didn't cheer when I told her. She just nodded, quiet. Jeremiah's hand steady over hers, the same way it had been for months now. And she said it felt strange, hearing something that mattered so much land so softly. I understood that better than she knew. I poured 3 glasses that evening, one for each of us, and I thought, not for the first time, about how much of this had started with a glass poured at another table entirely, in a language he never thought belonged to me. I'd stayed quiet for years before that dinner. Quiet about a diagnosis I carried alone out, of a kindness he never returned. Quiet about debts I absorbed instead of questioned. Quiet about small disrespects that build into something larger only once you finally stop excusing them one at a time. I used to think that silence was patience, Or maybe love wearing a tired disguise? I understand now it was neither. It was simply the shape I'd let myself fold into, until a table full of strangers gave me a reason to unfold. I didn't choose that night to be the night everything changed. I chose, a long time before that, to start paying closer attention, to start keeping what I noticed instead of letting it slip past unremarked. The dinner only gave that attention somewhere to finally land. Deshauna asked me, quiet, if I regretted staying as long as I did before any of it surfaced. I told her no. I told her some truths need time to gather enough weight to matter, and mine had simply needed those years to become undeniable instead of merely suspected. I raised my glass that evening, not toward anyone across a table this time, just toward the two people sitting closest to me now, and toward whatever came next for all of us, finally clear of a man who spent a marriage assuming silence meant surrender. It never did.